does AI provokes better or worse engineering? So on one side of the arguments, I can see people say that how AI produces shitty code. Oh, you ask AI to do some task, some activity, and you see like some spaghetti code, like unnecessary for loops, etc., etc., etc. So, and that will inevitably lead to code that's impossible to maintain at long term, or lots of bugs, security issues, etc., etc., etc. So, I'd like to bring a more grounded perspective on that end. So, AI is just but a tool, and actually, the final result of the code depends on who is using, the capacity of the engineer that is using it. So a shitty engineer will continue to produce shitty products. I don't necessarily believe with the idea that AI will necessarily produce legacy code that will be harder and even harder to update in near features with AI on top of it. But actually, we can craft our way to help AI developer code in the future as well. A commonplace problem across our industry is that we are not enforced to do best practice. We kind of know roughly what a best practice field routine looks like. So you write your code, you write unity and integration tests, you write documentation tests, you validate your code in lower environments like int, KA, etc. Then you kind of produce some sort of like metrics around your code. So like say a dashboard in Grafana, some sort of like measurement to see if while in production, your code is doing what it's supposed to do in large scale without the need of like having reports from consumers saying like, hey, I found a bug here and there. So, but in practice, we don't follow that. There is lots of places that the demands from product override the requirements for good engineering, and then engineers come with like a situation where they are like allowed to not practice, do not do good practices. So they're like, hey, I gotta ship the code to production. If I write tasks, I will delay this feature for another week or another day. Like, will you want that? And then, of course, like product doesn't want that. Product doesn't understand fully the reason for a good practice engineer. Basically, we end up in a situation where we are allowed to skip good practices. Sometimes like documentation falls behind, and once there's a huge amount of work to be documented, it becomes increasingly hard to document that work, right? So, and there comes AI. So allegedly AI can write all the code in a mere few seconds, right? And although I don't believe that like a feature you can do in a span of seconds, you got to still iterate with the development AI. You got to still to have a clear plan, a clear design, design for like possible failures, etc., etc., etc. But the thing is, let's say you have a feature that you could complete it in a span of like a day or two, just the code. With AI, you can spend that same amount of time designing and iterating with the AI to have your code done in a few minutes, but you also end up with documentation, you end up with like a plan of implementation design, you end up with unit and integration tests, you can end up with like a dashboard or something, some sort of like metrics around your feature, and all the more, because you spend that time planning with the AI, be it Cloud Code, GPT, Codex, or whatever, they have that context. So that leads to actually a higher bar for engineering. Now in the future, developing the code, shipping the code to production will not be the only like request, the only demand. We can enforce good practice. We can say, hey, you got to deliver code. It needs to have documentation up to date. It needs to have integration unit tests. And actually, that's what makes AI better, right? By having clear and up-to-date documentation, by having unity and integration tests, that helps AI develop a future code. An interesting point is that sometimes people say, hey, but still AI will develop a lesser quality code than me, like a worse code than I could produce. So two things about that. The first thing is that, well, if it is doing that, it's your fault. It's your responsibility to make AI produce better code. And you can do that by uploading context regarding like best practices. There's lots of like guides. For example, like in Rust, there are code guides for like how to actually write better Rustacean-like code, how to conform the rules, how to be more like, there are tools you can use like cargo clippy, cargo formatting. So there are these kind of like tools that already exist in community around a specific language, or even documentation around there that can help bring context for the AI to write better and cleaner code. So it's your responsibility as an engineer to take care of that. It's the responsibility of the engineer behind the AI use to make the code better. And also we end up with lots of documentation, we end up with lots of testing, validations, dashboards, lots of other features that in the past, usually we just consider tech debt. And now we can tackle that straight on. It's hard to predict where AI will go in the near future. It's still too early, and whoever says that has the answer for it is probably wrong because we're too close to have a clear view of the future. But I truly believe that AI doesn't necessarily lead to worse code bases. It can potentially lead to better engineering overall by simply the fact that we as engineers are able to utilize our best practice in our favor. It all comes down to the ability of the engineer himself or herself to ask AI to do proper engineering. And as for a quick example of that, let's say that I want to write some documentation for my application. I can say to AI, hey, write documentation about my feature or write documentation about my project. That's it, right? It will produce some sort of documentation. But if you are an engineer, the more knowledge you have, the better you can command AI. So you can say, hey, develop a C4 documentation for me, which is much better, cleaner, and well-designed and well-structured. So there you go. By just knowing engineering, you are able to leverage AI better to produce better engineering as well. So the limit of AI design and AI output at the end of the day is not the model, it's the engineer using the model.